During the Middle Ages, it was believed that everything in creation, including the human body, was derived from four basic elements of nature: earth, air, water, and fire. Many thought that if fire could be found in the body, then it might be possible for it to flare out uncontrollably. The Bible in Leviticus tells of the sons of Aaron being consumed by a mystical blaze. Since the early 1800s, it's been called spontaneous human combustion, a mystery where the human body is reported to burn from the inside out, reducing it to ash while its surroundings are untouched. We'll investigate classic claims of spontaneous human combustion as we talk to veteran firefighters who remain perplexed by these unusual events. We'll explore curious cases, one where the victim was consumed in just 20 minutes. Another where a house painter from London describes witnessing a woman breathing fire. And we'll interview fire investigators who have their own theories about the origins of these fires that appear to burn from within, here on The Unexplained. The classic profile of an alleged spontaneous human combustion victim is an older woman who is overweight, alcoholic, and infirm. They are usually alone at the time of the event. In many ways, 51-year-old Beatrice Oski fit that profile. But a profile doesn't reveal the human drama behind the case study. It was Thanksgiving weekend in 1979. Mrs. Oski kissed her son Frank goodbye and wished him a safe journey. Frank was going skiing for the weekend and had a long drive ahead. Ironically, it was the housebound mother's life that would be in jeopardy. Beatrice Oski struggled with a drinking problem. She was also handicapped, wearing a brace on her left leg. Years before, she had broken her ankle. Because she was a diabetic, it had never healed properly. Despite these problems, her son didn't worry about leaving her alone.
She was not scared to be alone. You know, she was a fairly brave woman, really. She just had she had one fear, and that was a fire.
The next morning, Shelley Oski, Frank's ex-wife, came to pick up some belongings from the Oski home. Knowing Beatrice was handicapped, she waited patiently for the door to be answered. But at a certain point, Shelley became concerned and let herself in.
Mom?
She smelled smoke and called out for her mother-in-law.
Mom?
When there was no answer, Shelley became frightened and called the fire department.
It was very warm in the house. Some smoke was still lingering, but not any real noticeable foul odors. Certainly not any smells that you would think would be associated with a human being, being burned.
As seen in this actual photo, the paramedics were confused by what confronted them.
It took a few minutes to actually digest the whole picture that there was a person actually sitting in the chair who had died.
The Bolingbrook, Illinois Fire Department backs up every paramedic team with a fire engine. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Daryl Hafner arrived on the scene.
We didn't really know what we had sitting down there on the floor, where there was a pile of papers, a bag of garbage, and we really had to stand back and get our senses together and say, what is this? And then I noted a foot, and I think there was a brace on one leg, and I thought, this has got to be a person.
The area from above Mrs. Oski's knees was burnt away, literally burned to the bone, yet things around her did not ignite.
Not a foot away was a newspaper, unburnt, a big lighter. No other damage from fire to the room, to the area. Just completely centralized in one spot.
Frank Oskey knows his mother was a careless smoker, and she had been seriously burned once before.
And on one occasion, I guess she fell asleep, and due to her drinking, the cigarette more or less landed on her abdomen, and it burnt a hole right in there. Not a deep one, but it did burn a hole. And she was so incoherent that she never realized that. But it never burnt her any further than, say maybe a 2-inch radius, probably just about like this. So that's why I do not believe, that a cigarette could have caused this.
Fire investigator Carl Natal understands why the Bolingbrook firefighters were so bewildered by what they witnessed. Fire professionals rarely see burn victims whose torsos and internal organs are so completely devastated.
We would expect to find a great portion of the body intact, or at least relatively intact. Typically what is found is light extremities, such as the tips of fingers, the tip of your nose, your earlobes. They suffer the damage first, and almost always they are obliterated to some extent.
The corpses are left with featureless faces and fingerless hands. On rare occasions, an autopsy might be required to determine the sex of the victim, but in most instances, they are easily recognizable as human. Larry Arnold, author of Ablaze, a book about spontaneous human combustion, has researched 400 mysterious fire deaths over the last 20 years.
In classic quintessential spontaneous human combustion cases, the point of origin of the energy that consumes the victim appears to originate in the torso, in the center part of the body, and radiates outward, much like a human fireball.
I remember walking into the lower level, or the family room, and seeing a very clean area, very, very light smoke stains on the ceiling and about 6 inches down on the walls. Highly irregular. There should be, more damage. There was a couch covered with clear plastic, and immediately next to that there was still an end table with a telephone and a lamp and the presence of some newspapers.
It is hard to fathom how there could be so little damage in a room where a fire had been so intense that it consumed Mrs. Oskey almost completely. The human body is incredibly difficult to incinerate. Crematoria place the body in a chamber called a retort and subject it to heat the equivalent of a blast furnace.
What comes out of the retort after several hours of exposure to temperatures as high as 22 to 2600 degrees Fahrenheit is not merely dust, but bone fragments which are then mechanically pulverized to the proverbial dust and ash.
Her bones did disintegrate, and the body disintegrated. I think she was about 170 some pounds, and we carried out about 65 pounds of what was left of her.
Where does the intense heat come from? How does a fire consume a body and not consume the whole building, or even ignite combustibles inches away? Fire investigator Pat Kennedy believes spontaneous human combustion is a myth. He begins to unravel the Oskey fire by looking at the possible source of its fuel.
Well, the human body is not particularly combustible, but the fat, animal fat, is combustible. In fact, it melts, turns to a liquid, and burns as what we call an ignitable liquid.
Dr. Steve Novella of the Connecticut Skeptical Society reasons that Mrs. Oskey burned like a candle.
A human body can be thought of as a candle inside out, where the fat is on the inside and the wick is the clothing which is worn on the outside.
To demonstrate the candle effect, pork fat is placed in a bag made from the leg of a child's cotton blend sweatsuit. The heat from the burning cloth melts the fat, which oozes through the open weave. The fat is the more abundant fuel source, and the fire leaves the cloth relatively undamaged.
Even the bones of the body do contain a large amount of fat. There is bone marrow within the bones, and this, again, can fuel the complete combustion of bones.
If Beatrice Oskey became a human candle, Why was the fire so localized? Why were the end table and ottoman the only things in her home to be damaged by fire? A burning object must give off a certain amount of radiant energy to be capable of igniting an adjacent object. In addition, the Oski house may have been so well insulated that it helped to extinguish the fire.
In the Oski house, they had gone through those efforts to reduce thermal loss and to reduce air exchanges.
A fire is similar to a human being in that it needs 15 to 16% oxygen to survive. Skeptics have theorized that Mrs. Oski's body fat burned like a candle, and that the fire extinguished because of the lack of oxygen. But we are still left with the puzzle of how this brutal fire began.
Having seen all the evidence, there's nothing that explains it. The firemen, they can't explain it. No one can explain it.
Upper Darby, Pennsylvania is a quiet town. Its stone houses were built in the early 1900s. The house at 527 Argyle Road in the Drexel Hill area doesn't stand out from the rest. But on November 8, 1964, it was the scene of something quite horrifying. In a second-floor sitting room, Mrs. Helen Conway, a 51-year-old widow, burned so quickly that more than 30 years after her death, fire officials are still puzzled. Retired Fire Chief Paul Haggerty was fire marshal of Upper Darby at the time.
She was babysitting 2 grandchildren, and her daughter and son-in-law went out for the evening. They were going to pick the children up sometime Sunday.
Conway's granddaughter Stephanie was watching cartoons on the first floor. Mrs. Conway, an invalid, used a bell to call for help. She asked Stephanie to bring her up a book of matches. The child brought them and went back down to watch TV around 8:30 a.m. Mrs. Conway's next-door neighbor was going to church and saw a glow at the window. She ran over to the house and Stephanie answered the door. Because the heat was so intense, the neighbor could not make it to the top of the stairs, and she called the fire department.
So approximately 8:50, 8:55, somewhere around there, the fire company responded. So that doesn't give you much of a window. So it had to be very fast. When the firemen got there, the fire was out. The heat was there, the doorknob was red hot, the door itself was hot, and when they opened the door, the smoke that hit them was hot.
Here was a fire scene even more macabre than the Oski case. There in the corner were the remains of Mrs. Conway, as seen in this photograph taken in her sitting room.
When they arrived, they didn't have to put any water on the body or anything. It was out. There was smoke coming from the chair and so forth. But there was no flame, no nothing.
Her upper torso was consumed to, one could say, ash and rubble. Her left arm was burned right down to the bone so that a bracelet could be seen dangling from her wrist bones.
I think she's on her toes a little bit, the way the position of her legs. I know they were blistered, there were blisters on them, but they weren't burned.
Paul Haggerty's years of arson investigation training taught him not to overlook this important piece of evidence.
So when I broke 2 blisters on her leg, the blisters were wet. I mean, the fluid didn't come out, but they were wet. They weren't dry. And according to what I learned, that she was alive at the time of the fire.
The fire was so intense that there was suspicion initially that perhaps foul play was involved, because it seemed that certainly accelerants must have been present to fuel this intense combustion. No accelerants were ever determined to be at the fire scene. No gasoline, no fuel oil, no kerosene, nothing that could have fueled the intense ferocity of this blaze.
In contrast to Mrs. Conway's body, only minor damage was apparent in the room. The telephone had started to melt, though nothing else on her end table seemed to be damaged. Her pack of cigarettes remained on a low table about 3 feet away. In the adjoining bedroom, there is little amiss. The bed sheets appear to be spotless. But on a mirrored dresser, there is a bizarre juxtaposition.
The plastic on the television set had begun to melt down. Next to the TV set was a little doll, dressed in tulle fabric, a mesh that is highly flammable. It's intact.
That type of fire you would remember all your life. I mean, it's something you would never forget.
The cause of death listed for Helen Conway was improper use of smoking materials. Could Mrs. Conway burn so completely in as little as 20 minutes?
It's impossible. You could stand there with a blowtorch and you wouldn't be able to consume her body that fast in the time frame.
There may be an explanation for the intensity of this fire. All cloth and upholstery materials are flammable. The fiber content and the openness of the weave determine that flammability.
In essence, the artificial clothes, the plastic clothes, the polymers, polyesters, rayons and the clothes created from cellulosics are more flammable than, say, cotton, and certainly more than wool.
In addition, 15 to 20 years ago, furniture was built with highly flammable, petroleum-based foam products, a deadly combination. But there's another element to be considered here. A chair burning in the middle of a room can radiate heat in all directions, a full 360 degrees. Helen Conway's chair was in the corner of the room. The radiant energy in this instance was compressed into only 90 degrees, which would intensify the fire. This could account for the speed of the fire, but not her disembodied legs.
What people find unusual in the cases that they attribute to spontaneous human combustion is that the extremities aren't burned because they are outside of the perimeter of the burning liquid. And they see this horribly burned body, and then the foot or feet and or hands and lower arms are not burned. They find that, oh, that's very unusual.
We find a clue to the macabre puzzle in the corner behind Mrs. Conway's chair. Fire investigators note 2 plumes on the wall. This may indicate that during the fire, the chair collapsed back, taking the upper portion of the body with it. The lower legs were then well outside the fire's radius. All the mysteries surrounding Helen Conway's death seem to lead us back to one question. How did the fire start? Larry Arnold believes that it came from within Mrs. Conway herself.
It appears in some cases there was what we would call the human Hiroshima effect, that at the subatomic level in the human body, a chain reaction begins to unleash itself. It radiates outward, literally outward, from the subatomic level to the atomic level to the physical structure of the human body. And in doing so, the tremendous amount of energy released instantaneously literally vaporizes the moisture content of the body away. These people become their own self-immolators, their own crematoria.
I had cases where people poured gasoline on themselves and set themselves on fire. And it was a fire from without, I mean, outside the body, that burnt the body. And this is altogether different.
Joe Nickel, editor of the Skeptical Inquirer, suspects cigarette smoking was the origin of the fire which consumed Helen Conway.
She was a heavy smoker. Secondly, she was a careless smoker, as evidenced, and this was in the reports by the officials, that there were burn marks all over her apartment from careless cigarette burns.
Mrs. Conway did smoke, admittedly, no problem. But people die from smoking accidents every year in this country and indeed around the world. In America, some 5,000 people a year unfortunately die as fire fatalities, many of those as a result of smoking mishaps. But we don't find bodies burned as completely as Mrs. Conway was.
George Mott had been a fireman in upstate New York for 30 years. and escaped injury from deadly flames hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. Tragically, on March 25, 1986, in Crown Point, New York, he met with a fire he could not control. Mott had recently retired and had been hospitalized for lung problems. He had just returned home. Since his illness, his nightly routine had changed. He kept track of new medications and learned to use an oxygen enrichment machine.
He got that after he got out of the hospital. They gave it to him so that at night when he was laying down, and it would make it easier for him to breathe. The air would go into his nose so he could breathe clean air during the night.
What happened the night of March 25, 1986, has been cause for much speculation. George's son, Kendall Mott, had checked in on his father every night since his father's return from the hospital. Because he had to work late on March 25th, Kendall wasn't able to make his regular visit. The next evening, he went to his father's house directly after work.
I reached for the door handle, and the door handle was warm. So, I automatically knew something was wrong. And when I opened the door, it was warm inside the house, and there was a burnt smell, like a metallic smell. I guess my immediate reaction was, oh God, because you walk in and the whole house is black because the windows had all been browned from the heat. And so it was really dark inside the house. It was like walking in a dungeon. So I went back to the back bedroom, went through the house. I called his name a couple times. And from what I could see, I didn't have a flashlight or anything, but it was just getting dark. What I could see, I could tell that, he was dead. You could see where the burn marks were on the bed.
When the fire department arrived, they found a scene unlike any other they had ever confronted. Bob Purdy was among the firefighters that day.
I've seen a lot of fires. I've seen quite a few fatalities where people were burnt, but I've never seen anything like this. Never.
These photos taken in the Mott bedroom that night reveal what firefighters witnessed.
The man was laying in bed and he disintegrated. You can see the V in the bed where he rendered down body fats, etc., bed clothing, whatever, and right down through the floor. And the house didn't catch on fire. And there's the matches, sitting right on that aerator, and just 6 inches above them, you see the brown spot. But the matches never ignited.
As firefighters moved through the house, they were confronted by incredible scenes at every turn. A greasy coating covered every horizontal surface. The water had evaporated from the toilet, and the tub was ringed with soot as if someone had taken a bath in black paint. The house itself was unburned, but objects within had been severely damaged. When investigators opened the refrigerator, they found a surreal scene. Not only the butter, but the plastic butter dish itself had melted. There was an unopened package of hot dogs that appeared to have been boiled in the wrapping.
We looked for accelerants, we looked at gas, we looked at electric, we looked at fuel. There's nothing. We even looked for maybe a lightning strike or something, and nothing. There was nothing there.
When investigators approach a fire scene, they look for patterns to help them determine the origins of the fire. These fire investigator training photos show that fires burn in upward cones, leaving telltale V patterns scorched on nearby walls. In the Mott living room, several of the interior walls were covered with cedar shingles. The New York State Police pointed to a V pattern on the wall surrounding an electrical outlet. They theorized that an electrical arc leapt from the outlet and started George Mott on fire. Mott then stumbled to his bed and died engulfed in flame.
We had several meetings, and the state police stayed with their story. And I couldn't buy that. My investigators couldn't buy that. Where they showed the V-shaped pattern was underneath a window where the curtains had caught fire and dropped to the floor and then burnt back up again. That's what that V pattern was from. It wasn't from electrical.
To prove their point, Purdy's men took apart the wall. Fire damage had come from the room's interior, not from within the outlet.
We went through them receptacles. There was no shorts in those receptacles. We took them apart. There was no short. I mean, we looked at all aspects. We looked at homicide. We looked at suicide. We looked at all the aspects of how this could happen, and nothing added up.
The only thing really left of George Mott identifiable as a human being were A, his lower right leg burned from the kneecap. His skull that people who knew him told us had mysteriously shrunken. The rest of George Mott was really powder, calcined dust, and you do not get that even under normal cremation circumstances.
Larry Arnold contends that it was a misfunction of George Mott's body chemistry which caused the fire.
The body temperature is regulated by a gland called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus not only regulates the body's furnace, so to speak, but it's also the seat of emotions, which in terms of spontaneous human combustion is very interesting. Many of the victims are depressed or morose, they're lacking the desire to live, or they're hot under the collar, so to speak.
Could a human being's body temperature produce enough heat to have caused this bizarre death? There are cases of hypothermia caused by dysfunction of the hypothalamus.
But there are no cases where the temperature is raised, beyond maybe 106 at the outside. And again, the temperature would have to be raised to over 200 degrees Fahrenheit before, say, body fat, for example, would ignite. So there is nothing even close to that reported in the medical literature.
Another puzzle still remains. What could have caused the strange fire selectivity seen on the objects in the Mott home? Science offers one explanation. Heat rises in a column. When it hits the ceiling, it spreads out, first in a thin layer, and then that layer thickens. Consequently, objects on the floor near a fire do not necessarily burn, while an object near the ceiling, 2 or 3 rooms away, will be damaged. The heat that night in the Mott home was intense. Mattress materials would become a flammable liquid and drip under the bed, eventually forming a pool. Mott's wooden flooring was easily ignited.
One of the ways we identify flammable or ignitable liquid fires is that they do tend to burn downward, that the liquid falls to the floor, often burns through it, that there are sharp lines of demarcation or sharp edges between what's burned and what's unburned.
Once the fire burned through the floor, it gained access to the oxygen in the crawl space below. The resulting draft would have intensified the fire like a bellows. We know how the fire progressed, but if it wasn't spontaneous human combustion, what started it in the first place?
We know Mott used to smoke, we know he was depressed, and we know 2 other facts that strike me as being difficult to explain unless we adopt the hypothesis that he might have resumed smoking, and that is that he had the oxygen enricher unit going full blast, but he was not wearing the mask. And secondly, why have standing of all places on your oxygen enricher unit a canister of matches?
His lungs were getting pretty bad at that time, so he put up a no smoking sign. And he'd even make me go out on the porch and smoke when I wanted to have a cigarette because he wouldn't let anybody smoke inside his house.
George took care of his health. He was a fireman. He knew the effects of fire. He knew the dangers of fire. Whatever struck down George Mott, he was ill prepared to deal with that night, and it cannot be explained away as a dropped cigarette.
That George Mott died in a fiery inferno is known. The actual ignition point of that fire will continue to be unexplained. But for believers in spontaneous human combustion, the source of the fire will always be George Mott himself. Those who are skeptical about spontaneous human combustion say the victim is always alone. There is never any eyewitness testimony. Don Carroll, a painter-decorator from London, wishes that were true. Carroll witnessed the horrifying death of his sister-in-law, Jean Saffin. It happened on September 10th, 1982, at 82 Chalfont Road in Edmonton. a quiet London suburb. It was a warm evening. John Saffin and his daughter Jean were in the kitchen. Jean was 60 years old at the time. Don Carroll, her brother-in-law, remembers her fondly.
She was mentally retarded from birth, but she was a lovely kid. She used to help her mother. She was always with her mother.
Since her mother's death, Jean was taken care of solely by her father, John Saffin. She would sit in her favorite chair most of the day. She couldn't read, but she liked to look through the newspapers. As Mr. Saffin sat relaxing after dinner, he noticed a flash of light out of the corner of his eye. When he turned to see what it was, he discovered that Jean was spewing fire from her mouth. Mr. Saffin leapt to his feet and tried to put out the fire. Don Carroll, who was visiting at the time, heard the commotion and rushed to the kitchen.
I pulled myself together and I rushed there and I got bowls of water. And I literally had to duck underneath to stop getting burnt by the flames that were coming out of her midriff and her mouth. Put it this way, if you was a child, you see fairy tale stories of a dragon breathing fire. You might see it on films when you was a kid, but it's just what I walked into. The flames were coming out of Jeannie's mouth, a good 2 feet, maybe more. And it was a roaring sound. We put the flames out, and she was just standing there, and she didn't cry, pain or anything, she didn't murmur.
Don Carroll phoned for an ambulance. Jean was taken to Mount Vernon Hospital's burn unit, where she went into a coma. The hospital staff told the family Jean's chances of survival were slim.
It may sound cruel, but to see her suffer, I think, would it have been better if she'd have gone straight away?
6 days later, after Jean Saffin died, the London police sent Constable Lee Marsden to investigate.
Upon arriving there, I remember seeing members of the family who were obviously upset and distressed, as they would be. Appeared to be very genuine people.
Constable Marsden interviewed John Saffin and Don Carroll about the incident. Based on their comments, he prepared a formal report which they confirmed and signed.
It would be normal practice when looking at the scene of this sort of incident to examine, to see whether there were any cigarettes lying around, any matches, ashtrays, to ask whether the person, in fact, herself smoked.
Jean Saffin never smoked, and Don Carroll thought she wouldn't even know how to strike a match. John Saffin told Constable Marsden that he had a pipe with a fresh pack of tobacco in it when the incident started.
He never used to smoke in the kitchen when Jeannie was in there. When Mr. Saffin smoked his pipe, he used to go into the front room.
With that knowledge, Constable Marsden tried to discover another source of ignition which may have started the fatal fire.
No plug sockets, electrical sockets, no gas points within reach of that chair. The floor was a hard floor. There was a gas cooker across the kitchen. You couldn't reach it by stretching or reaching your foot across. As far as I was concerned, I couldn't explain how this lady had gone up in flames.
Did Jean Saffin indeed breathe fire like a dragon? Is this a verifiable case of spontaneous human combustion?
Suppose that a few moments before these tragic events, the father, with his pipe going away, burning well, went over and knocked out the hot ashes on the windowsill. And now the breeze blows one of those hot embers in on her clothing.
If Jean Saffin's clothing caught fire, it is certainly possible that the flames may have spread to her face.
and somehow her flesh was, there was fire in front of her mouth in any case, either from her clothing or her own burning flesh. And if she were hyperventilating and huffing excitedly or something like that, that might give the impression you might have seen bursts of flame coming apparently from her mouth.
Confirming this, the coroner's report states that there was no evidence of burning at the back of Jean's mouth. It notes that she had 30 to 40% surface burns. The cause of death? Bronchopneumonia, fluid in the lungs, which is often the cause of death for fire victims. Larry Arnold believes that the wording of the coroner's report does not truly reflect the entire incident.
And we're told that she had some burn damage inside her mouth. It appears that the medical documentation isn't completely thorough in this case because Don Carroll, the son-in-law, and John Saffin in their statements to the police authorities mentioned things to us and in those statements that do not appear in the medical literature.
All the inside of her mouth, that was completely burnt. All the inside of her mouth, it was, I've never seen anything like it.
If no one knows how the fire started, Don Carroll wonders why the police never accused him or Mr. Saffin of setting Jean on fire.
Because they know it was human combustion. That's why. They know, but they will not tell anybody that it's what it is.
Don Carroll's belief in spontaneous human combustion is unshakable, and he is not alone. Even the 19th century novelist Charles Dickens found the mystery which surrounds spontaneous human combustion intriguing. Charles Dickens, the beloved 19th century British novelist, is known for his many fine works, including A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations. In 1852, he wrote the novel Bleak House, which originally appeared in monthly installments. Bleak House depicts the poverty and hopelessness of the urban poor during the Industrial Revolution. At the time, public drunkenness was a problem, and temperance advocates wrote about terrifying cases of drunkards dying of spontaneous human combustion.
Temperance Society loved to cite these cases of alcoholics and drunks and people like that, and to try to convince the public that this boogeyman of spontaneous human combustion might get you. So you better quit drinking and you better sober up and turn to religion. Dickens was so taken by this topic, and he thought it was a scientific fact, and so he chose in his great novel Bleak House to kill off the evil, sinister Mr. Crooks with the specter of spontaneous human combustion.
Are you there, Crook?
Dickens described Mr. Crook as continual in liquor. And in the December installment of Bleak House, he sends this sinful drunk to the devil in a fiery blaze. When the December 1852 issue came out, it caused quite a stir. Dickens was immediately confronted by his friend, the scientist, George Lewis. Lewis thought that spontaneous human combustion was an impossibility.
What Lewis was concerned about in the account of spontaneous combustion is that when such a powerful figure argues that something like spontaneous human combustion is possible, it will be believed by thousands and thousands.
Dickens shot back his response in the next installment of Bleak House. He inserted a long list of authorities who supported the possibility of spontaneous human combustion.
It's clear from some of the mistakes he makes in citing the cases and the particular cases that he cites that he got them all, or almost all of them, from one book in particular.
A popular medical text, The Anatomy of Drunkenness, was part of Dickens' library. In fact, all 30 cases that Dickens cites are from that text. Skeptics say this single source of information is not definitive proof of spontaneous human combustion. For Don Carroll, the recurring memory of Gene Saffin's death is proof enough.
You might laugh at it, I don't know, but I never believed in the supernatural or anything until I see this. My wife believes, and I'm inclined to believe with her, that she was always with her mother. Her mother died, and shortly after her mother died, this happens to Jean. We believe it could be psychic suicide. In other words, what she's saying is that Jeannie brought it on herself because she missed her mum.
For many years, researchers have been doing studies about the mind-body connection.
Now, we know how self-destructive rage, when it's contained, can be. We know that people in a state of emotional disturbance can hurt themselves dramatically. We've seen people become ill. We've seen immune systems shut down because of extreme rage, extreme depression. There's a great deal of evidence to suggest that the brain state affects the immune system.
Stander believes there may be a correlation between the brain's ability to affect the body's functions and spontaneous human combustion.
We ought to take cues from those investigators in the East who have attributed such phenomena to mysterious forces such as Chi or the Kundalini.
In the human body, there is an energy, quasi-electric in nature, that is called Kundalini, also Ki or Prana. It's the life force that makes us an animate, living organism. Eastern physicians have dealt with Kundalini and Ki and Prana for millennia.
During the making of a documentary in Java, the filmmakers met an acupuncturist with remarkable talents. Through meditation and practice, he had learned to harness the electrical currents in his body to the point that he could give another person a shock. He could also channel his energy in another way. He could produce fire with his naked hand. Larry Arnold has studied the works of many Eastern mystics. He discovered accounts of unbalanced Kundalini causing the sensation of excruciating internal heat. His research has led him to believe that if a person blocks this powerful energy, they might spontaneously combust.
Anyone who becomes familiar with skepticism in general, whether it's with regard to spontaneous human combustion or any of the myriad other paranormal or pseudoscientific beliefs, at one point faces what we call the psychology of belief. And part of that is the need to believe in something profound, something beyond or outside of ourselves, or even just the fascination with the marvelous or the fantastical. There are a lot of reasons to believe that the psychological need to believe is hardwired into our brains. For example, neurologists are very familiar with a phenomenon that we encounter in seizure patients known as hyperreligiosity. Patients who have seizures in their temporal lobe can sometimes have profound religious epiphanies during their seizures. When that part of the brain is seizing, it generates for them a profound sense that they are in the presence of God or somehow in the presence of the universe itself. A lot of belief in the paranormal is driven by a need for a sense of control. If you can't explain something or some phenomenon about the universe, you would invent an explanation for it.
Some will look at the cases of alleged spontaneous human combustion and find answers in the supernatural, while others will point to everyday human mishaps as the explanation. How these fires ignite may always be a source of contention. Only the victims know for sure, and they have taken that secret with them. The puzzle of spontaneous human combustion for now will remain unexplained.